Eric, welcome.
Matt, great to be here.
It's good to talk to you. There's so much going on right now, and I think the first thing we should get off the table is the fact that you and I are actually talking. Like we're in Washington D.C. right now. We shouldn't be allowed to have a civil conversation, but as far as I can tell, you don't want to punch me or anything.
No, and these chairs are too heavy to throw at each other.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Well, why don't you tell my folks like who you are and what your background is and how we ended up sitting together.
Yeah, so I run a nonprofit called Citizen University, and all our work is about teaching the art of citizen power, how to effectively exercise power in civic life in ways that make a difference. And we do work around the country and pretty well across the political spectrum. And you and I got connected a few years ago because I think we realized that across the left and the right, across all these different parts of the political ecosystem, we're living in a time of bottom-up citizen power, and that there's a lot for people to learn from each other across that ecosystem. That's the way that we've always run as an organization, trying to connect these dots that wouldn't otherwise connect. My own background is, more from the left. I worked in politics, worked in Capitol Hill for a Democrat, worked for President Clinton when he got elected as a speechwriter in his first term, and then later, toward the end of his second term, was his deputy domestic policy advisor. And so, my world politically has been Democrats, and my views generally are progressive. I live in Seattle, super active in the $15 minimum wage fight, super active.
The left coast.
The left coast, super active in things like our state passing by a vote of the people, a measure for background checks on gun purchases. So things that some of your people will be like, hey, what the heck is Matt doing talking to this guy, right? And yet on almost every one of these issues that I've worked on as a citizen, it's been, again, this phenomenon of bottom-up citizen activism and citizen power that's shifted the frame of the possible in politics. And I feel like this moment that we're in, the exact same thing could be said and was said of the Tea Party. The exact same thing is said right now of libertarians who are emerging and rising or discovering themselves in different ways and realizing, wow, this is a time where these top-down hierarchies are busting apart, where old establishments are crumbling, where everyday folks are realizing, I actually have the power to change the game, right? And I think that's how we came together.
Yeah, so you're literally sitting here speaking to the enemy because I'm a former Tea Party organizer, libertarian. I put a real focus on liberty and getting government out of people's lives. And I think back to 2 or 3 years ago when we met, our hosts had set up this debate where I was debating you and George Will was on my side.
That's right.
And another progressive professor was on your side. And I think we disappointed them a little bit because we didn't go after each other the way they wanted us to. They wanted us to go at loggerheads. And afterwards you came up and I said, I think we may agree on some things.
Yeah.
And that started that conversation. I think that's sort of emblematic of the democratization of everything. You call it citizen power. I think everything's becoming more democratized, and it's happening in business, it's happening in culture, it's happening in media, and it's happening in our politics.
Mm-hmm.
And the old left-right thing, I think, particularly post-Trump, makes less and less sense to me. I can't put everybody in their neat boxes anymore. So that's why we've launched this series, sort of tongue-in-cheek, called "Speaking with the Enemy."
Yeah.
But we're provoking people. I think we're taking some risks here. My audience is saying, Matt, what the hell are you doing? And I suspect at the very same time, my audience by now has probably started fighting with your audience, and they're having these hopefully spirited and civil conversations about things that they disagree on. But I think that's healthy, and I think that's part of your mission in life is to have better conversations.
It is, and not just better conversations, but better arguments, right? I think this moment we're in, if we're going to start treating each other like grown-up citizens, it's not to pretend that we don't have differences, but nor is it to just live in this kind of perpetual loop of self-righteous anger where I can only see you as an enemy, right? Let's actually talk about the role of government. Let's talk about the balance that you strike between individual liberty and actually sustaining a community or society. Let's talk about the ways, as you've talked to me about, that those two things aren't polar opposites the way that people on the left might think of caricature your worldview as putting them, right?
Yeah.
But having these arguments in a way that is grounded in history, grounded in values, I think is the real opportunity right now. Like it's super easy for us to start flaming each other, right? It's super easy for each of us to kind of go to people in our ideological tribes and just paint pictures of the other. That's, to this point now, boring, basically, right?
Yeah.
Way more interesting, actually, to to humanize, number one, but then number two, to actually get into it in a way that grown-ups can and should, right? Now, the thing I'll say about, like, my views generally are progressive, but our work at Citizen University is not inherently progressive. It is just about trying to get folks across the spectrum who care about bottom-up citizen power to deal with one another, right? The analogy I've used is, I'm a baseball fan, and I grew up outside of New York City, so I'm a giant Yankee fan, right? And that means that by blood, by kind of all divine requirements, I hate the Red Sox, right? And I hate Red Sox Nation, and that's just this tribal thing. But what Yankee fans and Red Sox fans have in common is an abiding underlying interest in the health of the game.
Yeah.
Right? If the game of baseball is sick, corrupt, rotten, rigged, that works to the detriment of both Yankee and Red Sox fans, right? And a lot of what we do at Citizen University is trying to get folks from Team Red or Team Blue or whatever other color you might want to assign and say, hey, the game is sick, right? Our democratic game and system is rigged, is corrupt, is broken, and let's actually figure out what we have in common in terms of our strategies for re-rigging it. Right, and that's why we talk about that PBS thing that you and I did, where they figured we were going to fight, and we realized that actually we share a lot in common, because we do think right now that it's for us to find ways bottom up to fix things, even if your preferred solutions aren't going to look like my preferred solutions.
Okay, if you're going to use a baseball metaphor, I'm going to use a Grateful Dead metaphor.
All right, good.
And this is my metaphor for how I think about the world, how I think libertarian philosophy happens in practice. I think about the whole thing as a Grateful Dead parking lot, and the community that, and people under a certain age aren't going to get this analogy at all. So yours is better than mine, because baseball's still
Except
a thing.
baseball's dying, and nobody young cares about baseball anymore.
But there used to be this robust community of Deadheads. They were fanatical about the music, but they very much cared about the brand, and they protected each other, and they came up with this spontaneous set of rules that generally held things together, even though no one said, starting with Jerry Garcia, he never would have used this word, but he was an anarchist. He didn't want to tell anybody what to do, because he thought that would stifle the spontaneous power of the community. But they took on that responsibility for themselves, and I think we're at that place in American history where it feels like the old systems are falling apart. All of these old top-down institutions, not just in government, but outside of government, that used to decide things don't function anymore. And we're going to have to figure out, as citizens, how to solve those problems, how to come up with answers, how to figure out a way to get along without hurting each other, even though we have these fundamental differences. And that seems like a perfect segue for this book right here. And I love this book, and this is your new book. Tell us a little bit about the point. And this was written, I think, before Trump.
It was written. I finished it just as the election was coming, and once the election had happened, I had this first instinct of, oh gosh, there might be a whole bunch of things I have to change. But actually, as I went through, almost nothing. Where I mentioned Donald Trump, I now said President Donald Trump. But it wasn't really about him or Hillary or Bernie or Rand Paul or anybody, right, who was running for president of the United States. It was about us. And it was about this age that we're in of bottom-up citizen power, which is not just this moment in 2017 as you and I are sitting here. I mean, just in the United States, it rewinds to at least the emergence of the Tea Party, the emergence of Occupy Wall Street, right? The emergence of Black Lives Matter, the emergence of libertarianism as a force in national politics. across the spectrum, all of these movements. Today, one that's quite with us, the Dreamers, right? That weren't ordained by anybody, didn't ask anybody for permission, spontaneously emerged in response to things being off, things being rigged, things being broken, right? That's the age we're in. And I wrote this book really to really help people make sense of this moment. And that's not just kind of in a, oh, from a distance, let me observe these movements here, but more actually how you and I and any other person who's going to read this book can get literate in power. Understand how you can read and write power in everyday life, right? And I think even the topic of power to a lot of people, maybe, I don't know, maybe less so on your side, you tell me, but a lot of people on the left have an immediate allergic reaction to such candid talk about power, right? It sounds like, oh, this is who is this guy coming in? He's going to talk about stuff about domination and oppression and everything. And why is he celebrating this? Why is he trying to teach this stuff, right? And that's the first lesson of the book, which is if you have qualms about naming and talking about and being clear-eyed about power, you got to get over it, right? Because this is the language of not just politics, it's the language of human life and how we are spontaneously organizing ourselves or reckoning with institutions and hierarchies that are actually working against our interests. You got to first be able to name and see power in the first place, right? Once you do that, then you can start breaking it down and understanding, okay, well, here's how it works, here's how it flows, here's who has it, here's who does not have it, here's why that is, and here's how you can change that, right? And that's a big part of what the book is about, is here's how you can change that.
The timing was pretty profound, and some of that may be luck. You know, you never know exactly what's going to happen when it happens. But I viewed this, you're more powerful than you think. Look at the product placement for the camera here. As it's a non-cynical update of Saul Alinsky. And he, of course, was a classic community organizer. All of us Tea Partiers were reading Alinsky. And you know, the founding of various grassroots organizations were based on that idea that you got to show up, yeah, and you got to do that. But you're right. Like if you use the word power amongst libertarians, they immediately think of Lord Acton. Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts. Absolutely. But I view the management of power. It's really about dispersing power. It's really about making sure that everybody has a little bit of power so that nobody has all of it. And I think we agree on that.
Yeah.
In different ways. The question moving forward, I think, is, you know, how do we have all of these conflicting visions and we have all this economic anxiety. We definitely have left and right, this frustration, this lack of trust in institutions. You know, we think we're getting screwed by the man. Mm-hmm. And we think the game is rigged, as you've said. And
we are, and it is.
And we are, and it is. And that's, to me, that's classic public choice. Like, concentrated power allows insiders to collude against the rest of us. What's the balance between, when I say democracy, I'm thinking about dispersing power. Yeah. But I would never, ever want a democratic system where 51% of the people that show up get to do whatever they want to 49%. That's not justice. That's not social justice. That's nothing. And I think you'd agree with that. But what is the balance for you?
Well, I guess I would back up a step. I think you're absolutely right that we agree on the power of dispersed power, right? I think one of the things that I say in the book and that you and I have talked about, which is that anytime any of us actually takes a candid inventory of the power that you have, right? It could be people power, it could be ideas power, maybe it's money power, maybe it's social norms power, whatever that kind of little mound of capital that you have is, right? Your ability to move people and ideas and so forth. Once you take stock of that, then you face this very simple binary choice as an individual, which is, shall I hoard or shall I circulate, right? And I hate hoarders, right? And I think you and I, just kind of on a fundamental level, hate hoarding and hate monopoly, right? I'm wired to be a monopoly buster, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of this, it's not even philosophical, it's kind of a visceral thing. And, you know, I talk about in this book there being these three fundamental laws of power that I actually think would accord really well with a libertarian worldview, right? Or they're not inherently at all opposed. Law number one is that power concentrates, right? So it's not just a law of politics; it's a law of nature, right? Though advantage compounds and disadvantage compounds, right? Those who have some tend to get more, right? And that's among people, but that's also in nature. I mean, where leaves first start to collect, once the leaves fall, more leaves will tend to cluster and things will kind of form clumps in these ways, right? So number one, power always concentrates and compounds. Law number two, power always justifies itself, right? And a libertarian knows this well because a libertarian has been swimming upstream against a politics in which there are all these dominant narratives about the wisdom of the state that you've got to actually push back against, right? But whether it's that narrative or in the context of Black Lives Matter, a narrative that law and order is the right thing, that police know best, and that cracking a few heads is the price you pay for safety and security, that's a dominant narrative through which power justifies itself, right? And sometimes they're explicit like that. Sometimes there are these implied kind of background stories about why things are the way they are. White supremacy is that kind of storyline, right? But power is always justifying itself. And if all you had were these first two laws, you'd be stuck in a pretty grim loop, right? This doom loop in which power is always compounding and concentrating into fewer hands, and those people who have it are always telling everybody else why you should be happy that they're lording it over you, right? What busts us out of that doom loop is the third law, which I think is another basis for which we have productive conversations, and that's this: power is infinite, right? And I don't mean this in some woo-woo way. I mean it literally, that you can generate brand new power out of thin air through the magic act of organizing, right? You're proof of this. The emergence of the Tea Party a bunch of years ago was proof of this, that people who had no prior permission, had no prior institutional structure, began to communicate with one another, began to connect their sense of frustration and anger about where they thought the country was going, and they organized, and that generated power out of thin air where it didn't previously exist, and it changed the equation not only in the Republican Party, but in national politics, right? That reality that through this magic act of organizing, you can it's not physics. In physics, if you're going to get more heat or energy, someone else in the system has to get less, right? That's the conservation of energy, and that's thermodynamics. But I'm not talking about physics. I'm talking civics. Yeah. And in civics, you can generate more power. That didn't diminish me at all, right? And what I can do is I can generate more power to countervail that, right? But if I can actually wake up and organize folks who care about my view of the issue, right? And I think that we're living in an age where people are remembering the infinitude of power, right? And that you don't have to wait for it to trickle down from somebody else, but that you can actually generate it from the bottom up.
And you get this multiplier effect, and this is almost a Hayekian principle that people that come together in voluntary cooperation are so much more powerful as a group than any one of them could have conceivably pulled off. I used to joke as a community organizer, I wish we could do grassroots without so many people, because people are so difficult to deal with.
People are friction, in your perfect system.
They all have their own preferences, and the bigger the movement gets, the more complicated it gets. But that process of working things out is the fundamentally human challenge.
Well, this is one of the ways in which you've pushed me, and one of the things that I feel like I've learned from you. I had a more cartoonish picture of libertarianism, and to be sure, there are people who actually fit the cartoon image.
Oh yeah.
But one of the things that you've pushed me on in particular is this idea that notion of liberty is not inconsistent with an idea of community, right? And that the idea of this notion of spontaneous order that you're talking about is not about just don't tread on me and let me do whatever the heck I want. It's actually about the ways in which community forms and collective action emerges, not because of a collectivist entity telling anybody to do it, but because people are aggregating their preferences, their norms, their beliefs, their desires in a way, and that there's actually when that emerges, as with Deadheads, as with the Tea Party, as with Black Lives Matter, as with $15 now. Put aside the politics of each of those issues, you have spontaneous order emerging here in a way that there's the glue of community, people kind of sensing that they're in it together in something. And even you using the phrase community organizer,
yeah.
I know maybe at the beginning you used it kind of tongue in cheek, right? Because you were sort of mocking people on the left who believed in and loved that language, but that's actually what you are, right?
I was actually more trolling my side because because I never understood what part of community organizer we were so angry about, because we believe in community and it's okay to be organized. This is not a bad thing. And I thought it was forcing people to think, but I definitely triggered some of my friends.
Well, look, that also touches on where we have differed too, right? I mean, I think I see the value of moments and arenas where spontaneous order emerges and where people, when left to themselves, can generate their power in this way. I'm more concerned than you are that because of my law number one, that power concentrates and compounds, that naturally, even what starts out as spontaneous kind of laissez-faire order tends toward clumping and concentration, right? And that the actual nature of systems is to tip toward great inequality, and that when those systems tip far enough, the system falls over and it dies, right? And that the point of public policy, the role of government, is actually to be, to use another metaphor, to be the gardener of this garden, right? A gardener doesn't just say, hey, go and grow, do whatever you can, see what happens, right? Because for a while that'll work great until a few weeds take over, and then those noxious weeds choke off growth in the entire garden, right? So part of the role of not just government, but actually our role as citizens is to be thinking about when do we weed, when do we seed, when do we feed, right? Now, you have more faith in the power of that garden over time to heal itself, to remedy itself, but now we're just arguing about when to intervene, right? It's not a matter of whether we have absolute faith that complete hands-off actually yields a good society.
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenge for your side is what happens when government concentrates power, and I think it took me a while to understand what the phrase Black Lives Matter meant, because our visceral reaction was, well, all lives matter, and there was that argument. Like, people were literally shouting those two phrases at each other, and through you, I was able to actually dig a little bit deeper and meet some of the organizers from Black Lives Matter. But I think their fundamental concern is that cops have too much power, and they abuse it. And there's been racial disparities that are clearly demonstrated through the data, and that happens because there's no accountability in monopoly power systems. And I do think that's a metaphor for broader concerns that libertarians have about centralized government, because once you centralize that power, the incentives of the power elites are not necessarily the same as yours at all. Like, corporations get at the table first, and power players get at the table first, and you get this
cronies of all kinds.
You get this symbiotic relationship, and by the way, our cat's going to tear down our studio.
Chaos.
But that's that clash, and I view dispersing power as a way to hold those elites accountable. But the danger is always there when you give police serve a fundamental function in our society, but if there's no accountability, it becomes a source of tyranny.
Yeah, I think we agree on that. Actually, I think what you're describing about both Black Lives Matter in particular, but actually more broadly, this issue of criminal justice reform is one where over these last few years, there has been this interesting line-scrambling, box-busting new conversation that you suddenly realize there are a lot of strange bedfellows who agree that when you have unchecked, unaccountable police, when you have a sentencing system that just feeds a system of mass incarceration, when your default settings in criminal justice are to kind of reward state power in everything from civil asset forfeiture to penalties, disparate penalties for the same crime, that's bad for everybody, right? And I think there are people who are social justice progressives and limited government conservatives and libertarians who are, without diluting one drop of their principles, are coming to find common cause there in fighting that system. But you said something earlier that I think is really worth underscoring, which is that people on the left are often partially blind to concentration of power when it's in government, right? And my return kind of observation is that people on the right are often partially blind to concentration of power in the private sector, in the market, right? And one of the most simple and obvious things that people have got to do is basically to have binocular vision here, right? And actually see that, to name one of these is not to cancel out the other. Actually, both are happening, right? And both are a menace to liberty and opportunity, right? Both are forms of monopoly. Where you and I might differ is that I still think that, government is, at the end of the day, the check on the concentration of power that can occur in the marketplace, right? And that the reverse is not true. It's almost never the case that the market is a check on concentrated power in government. Citizens are, right? And I think that's the part of the equation that we're both involved in right now. But I think the reality is that not enough people on either side can see that both of these are a problem right now, right? Instead, we fall into this thing where it's the equivalent of Black Lives Matter, all lives matter, right? State power, monopolize state power is bad. Well, monopolize private sector power is bad, right? And I think this, instead of seeing that there's a fusion to be had here, people are just kind of retreating to their own partial view.
Yeah, and I think the thing that I've been obsessed with, and Free the People has been obsessed with, is these areas of common ground, and I call it transpartisan, because people can come together from the left and the right, libertarian, progressive, and find substantial common ground on an issue like criminal justice reform, like civil asset forfeiture, like mass incarceration. But I would add crony capitalism. I would add too much foreign adventurism, and there's a host of issues where we don't have to pretend to get along just to keep the country together. We're gonna find real common ground. And I've been fascinated by the fact that Rand Paul and Mike Lee are working with some of the most progressive members of the Senate, and I think the secret sauce there is that they're not just constitutional conservatives. There's a real libertarian streak in my side that's willing to work with progressives who have a civil libertarian streak. Mm-hmm. There's work there, and my hope is let's find a couple things. Let's actually work through this. Let's fix it from the bottom up. Washington still doesn't want to do it. Mm-hmm. Criminal justice reform has probably taken a small step back with the election of Donald Trump.
Yeah.
maybe a small step. But we're going to have to do this from the bottom up, and in the process of doing this, we might actually figure out these language barriers that our tribes have that don't allow us to communicate, and we might also learn that the other side's these aren't caricature monsters. They're people trying to figure out stuff too.
Well, here's the thing: is that the more local you are, the easier that is to do, right? And I think it's when politics gets totally nationalized that it does become this kabuki theater of people just posturing at each other and then emailing each of their respective bases to raise money off their posturing, and
lots of capital letters.
Lots of capital letters, lots of just apocalypse, right? But when you're and again, this is actually one area where, in this age of citizen power across left and right, relocalizing the exercise of civic power, relocalizing the practice of civic power, is, I'm a believer right now in the age of Donald Trump that there's plenty of resisting to be done at the national level, but resistance is not enough. The only way we're going to regenerate the civic life of this country is if we start locally. Right, and I think plenty of folks on your side would agree with that. Right, I think this idea of how do you show up in your neighborhood and in your community? How do you show up as somebody who's going to figure out what the rules are, who decides how power and resource get allocated? Practicing that, practicing getting engaged in that and changing the game and the story and the equation of power in an arena where you can feel and see and touch it, but also where you can't demonize people because these are other human beings you live next to, right? They're not, again, distant cartoon characters. It's going to be on us, right? I'm certainly not waiting for Donald Trump to deliver us. You know, his predecessor, who I supported and liked, there were too many other folks who voted for Barack Obama who did think that Barack Obama was going to save the country and save the culture. And no president is. No governor is. Even no mayor is, right? It's going to be us deciding we're going to deal with each other, find areas where we can work together where we can, not flame on each other when we can't, but actually doing so in a way that recognizes this is a face-to-face deal and it's a game of infinite repeat play. Like there is no final victory where I wipe you off the face of the earth or vice versa, right? And so we got to deal with each other.
There is that, and I think this may be one of the upsides of Donald Trump is maybe it's a slap in the face to people who thought that if we just elected the right person, the perfect person, and put him in the presidency and gave him lots of power, him or her, that everything would be okay. And it's always been inconceivable to me that any one person would know enough, would have the abilities to solve this complex, beautiful thing we call America. But there's also sort of the ugly side, like you don't want to give anybody that much power, and that this is something that I was complaining about as a Tea Partier. I still complain about it, hopefully consistently when Trump abuses executive power. But in the process of doing all this, I realized that you know when Tea Partiers were chanting the rule of law and defend the Constitution, I don't think people other than people in our tribe even knew what we were talking about. And so we gotta find that common language, because you want there to be a fair set of rules that don't change depending on who got elected, because that shifts the responsibility to us, but it protects us from tyrants.
Yeah, you know, I do think. I mean, this is one thing I will give Donald Trump credit for. He wouldn't seek it or take it, but he single-handedly has sparked the greatest surge of civic engagement, participation, and kind of awareness that we've seen in this country in half a century, right? So you talk about how, you know, a decade ago or so, you know, you and others were out there talking about rule of law. Maybe not enough of the country understood what you were talking about. A lot more people understand what you're talking about now, right? A lot more people have awakened to the emoluments clause. They've awakened to the separation of powers. They've awakened to Article 1 of the Constitution. They've awakened to these debates about not only what is the role of government, but what is the role of this branch of government, and why was the design of this constitutional scheme meant precisely to guard against an unprepared, unfit, unbalanced potential tyrant, right? These are the times we're in, but that's just at the constitutional layer, right? Again, what I think Free the People has been about, what's been so interesting to me about watching Free the People in the way that you've been creating narratives of libertarian principles in ways that reach particularly younger audiences, but audiences that, again, are transpartisan or across different ideological divides, is that, again, this is not a storyline of who's in the Oval Office. It's not a storyline of who's in the Beltway, right? It's a storyline of, you know, the title line, you're more powerful than you think. We are more powerful than we think if we activate, if we get skilled up, if we actually read up on the principles of what the heck we're supposed to be doing in this experiment together, and then if we practice, right? And I think this is the silver lining in this moment right now, is that there are a lot more people now perked up and sitting up whose attention we have now. People who are discovering, holy cow, I guess I'm kind of a libertarian. Or holy cow, I've always been sympathetic to social justice causes, but it's no longer okay for me to sit on the sidelines when people are walking around in torchlight rallies at nights, you know, chanting Nazi slogans, right? It's not, I got to get off the sidelines, right? And so you and I share this opportunity right now, and I think what, of saying to folks who are stepping on the field, okay, before you just start running around willy-nilly and get yourself worn out and exhausted so that you're vomiting again, you know, get in shape, get civically fit, understand how to play this game and how to actually be effective on the field. And I think that's the moment we're in right now.
Let's talk about, like, we've been talking a lot about the upside and the potential of people power, like the things we could do together to solve problems without waiting for the permission of the president or an elected official. And we both see the upside of this. We think that that's a potentially beautiful thing, but there's a cancer right now, and you touched on it just now. The neo-Nazis and white nationalists and the emerging violence between two extremes. My side would point to Antifa as sort of the mirror opposite of that, and I don't think they're moral equivalents, but I do think that violence in the public square should be absolutely zero tolerance, unacceptable, regardless of who does it, for whatever reason. And I think that my side has to take responsibility for denouncing anybody that claims the mantle of whatever it is, things that we believe. And we tried very hard to do that during Tea Party organizing. We really focused on, I was talking about this last night with you, we studied Gandhi and Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement in particular. There was an argument about it during the civil rights movement. Do we fight back, or do we not? And I've always thought in a fundamental way that Martin Luther King had the right strategy. And I don't think he was a pacifist. I think he was trying to win the hearts and minds of people that weren't paying attention, and he did it. He did it well. So how do we deal with this cancer? I mean, I think it's things could go the wrong way here, and things could get really violent. And once people are in their tribes and we're fighting, I think we've lost something profound about America.
Yeah, I agree on the baseline on the King approach. I mean, I don't think violence is ever the answer in civic life. I mean, there's no question that violence is a form of power, and people have recognized that from the time that humanity began. But I think that in a system like ours, when you're resorting to violence, the system is really sick, right? And if you think about Antifa, you said something the other day that really stuck with me. It's true of both Antifa and Klansmen. If in American civic life you have to hide your face while participating, then you probably don't have a lot of faith in the power of your ideas, right? or in the moral justice or appeal of your approach.
Yeah, you know that good people aren't going to be with you, so you hide.
You hide your face, right? Now, that said, I absolutely reject the idea that there is, and I know you're not saying this, but that there is moral equivalency between neo-Nazis on the one hand and those who would want to combat or contain them on the other, right? This is a question of tactics that, it does not only my side, it does our country no good to try to contain neo-Nazism with violence, right? With unchecked, rampant violence. Like, not helpful, not okay, not morally right, nothing good about that.
Yeah, don't feed the Nazis.
Don't feed the Nazis,
because
right?
they feed on violence.
Yeah, they are almost begging for it, right? The way that they will get amplification is if there is that kind of violence in response to their provocation, right? That said, in this case, the original sin, so to speak, is Nazism, right? It is white nationalism, and I think the thing that let's rewind back to Black Lives Matter and the kind of instinct and reflex that people have to say back to that. Well, all lives matter, right? We've got to recognize right now that we never had, and we certainly don't have today, a society where everybody's in equipoise and equilibrium, and everybody's starting from the same point, right? The fact that Black Lives Matter has to be said is because we have a system today that does not value black lives in criminal justice, in policing, in education, in employment, right? And so kind of what's implied when people say Black Lives Matter is black lives ought to matter. Black lives should matter just as much as non-black lives, right? That's what's being implied and said there not that white lives matter any less, but it's sort of a, hey, we actually would love to get to that dreamy equilibrium place, but we're not there, right? And I think that being able to hear each other in that way, and part of what I think the time that you've gotten to spend through our work at Citizen University with some of those folks is to kind of understand that kind of moral context for where they're coming from. But in this moment right now, when you look at the rise of white nationalism and so much of that angry, grievance-fueled force that is fueling these neo-Nazis and white nationalists is this sense that they are somehow oppressed, right? Is this sense that they are somehow on their heels or on the defensive. And I think that people across the left and the right have to actually get real about where we are as a country, right? We have a system where even if you are not economically privileged, if you are white, you bear a measure of privilege simply for not having to face some of the risks that you bear in this society for not having white skin, right? And if we can't name that as grown-ups, then that's our problem. That's our first problem, right? And I think so. The way we contain neo-Nazism and white nationalism is in the first place to get real about it, right? And I think that is that's number one. But I think number two then is you're absolutely right, kind of saying that we've got to lock arms and approach this in a nonviolent way, in a way that actually has faith in our ideas, and where we show that, yeah, we can have differences of worldview on issues of race, on affirmative action, or on whatever it might be. But that's in the bounds of normal, healthy, democratic politics and the work of self-government and kind of figuring out how we're going to prioritize what we do together, right? This stuff over here is out of bounds, and we've got to contain it in a profound way. I don't know, your question tactically of how do you do that?
Yeah.
Do you do that by ignoring them, or do you do that by really arguing with them? I don't know. What do you think about that?
I think that sometimes by showing up, and particularly if it's in a violent way, you're feeding them, you're making them bigger than they are. The Vice News feature of that guy, he loved it. You saw the glow in his eyes. Finally, someone's going to listen to me as I say crazy stuff. I think you ignore them, and then you ridicule them, but you never feed them. And I think that's the only way we manage that. And zero tolerance for Nazis, zero tolerance for white nationalists. We denounce it with hopefully a unified moral authority that's unacceptable. But I don't think you ever feed them, because that's how we lose, and that's how both violent sides rise up, and they start fighting, and citizens get left out of that equation.
I think the question that we all have to ask ourselves, and this is not a blame-casting thing, this is just literally like what's a way of asking what's our own responsibility, is what do we do about the white nationalists who don't carry torches, right? It was heartening to see so many elected officials come out immediately after Charlottesville and denounce white nationalism and white supremacy, but I wondered to what extent they actually understood what they meant when they were denouncing white supremacy, right? Because white supremacy isn't just Klansmen and neo-Nazis and people who are outright saying it explicitly, right? White supremacy is also back to our criminal justice system, right? White supremacy is institutional structural ways in which games have been rigged to harm many non-whites, particularly blacks, right? And I think how we deal with that as a country is partly for politics, but it begins with our taking some responsibility personally, right? And again, this is not like blame casting or blame taking. This is just like, what's my piece of this, right? I'm not black or white, right? I could say, hey, dudes, I'm sitting this one out, right? You all figure this out because I'm not harmed by this directly. But that would be folly. I am harmed by this, right? I am absolutely implicated in this system here, and I have a responsibility as someone who is a non-black, non-white to change the way in which our system works, right? And that's my piece of this. That's why I'm bringing this up. But I think that the bigger thing that I think at the end of the day is wholly in accord with libertarian worldview is asking each individual to think, what's my piece of this, right? What do I own here? Not just what do I get to be, what do I get to slough off, or what do I get to kind of push back against? But what is my responsibility for making sure the system is whole and healthy?
The responsibility of liberty.
How do you get to be what does it mean to be a good deadhead? Right? Literally, taking it there. To be a good deadhead doesn't just mean to like the music or to push back against anybody who's trying to shut down a concert or doesn't like the music. There are responsibilities to actually sustain the trust and the community and that sense of shared identity and belief, such that Jerry Garcia could say, hey, I'm not going to try to control this, right? And so the culture of sharing mixtapes, the culture of doing that in a way that respects this, but also recognizes that, hey, we're not going to try to take advantage of them. They are the creators of this music and this content. We're going to feed it. Even if we're trading mixtapes, we're going to buy concert tickets. We're going to buy paraphernalia. We're going to sustain this thing that we're all part of here. We're not just going to be moochers, right? Yeah. That's what it means to be a good deadhead. And the question of what does it mean to be a good citizen is actually in some ways very, very similar.
I'm going to end this with the dead metaphor because it's perfect. Thank you, Eric, so much.
Thanks, Matt. Great to talk with you.